Welcome to The Breakaway with David and Fabian. We are here shooting at the Heritage Foundation, and we have a very special guest that I'd like to introduce, Mr. Richard Stern. Richard Stern is the director of the Grover Hermann Center for the Federal Budget at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for being on, Richard.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So yesterday we were listening to you speak here at the Heritage Foundation about the economics and what's been happening with the budget and this explosion of $35 trillion in debt that we now have in the country. Can you explain a little bit about how we got to this point and what it means for the average person to have a debt that high?
Absolutely. So the way we got here is the way you imagine: total incompetence and total malfeasance of the government. Keep in mind, the debt is really just another form of taxation. So you pointed out it's $35 trillion. I like to call it America's second mortgage. It is $260,000 per American household. Wow. All of that is money stolen out of the economy that could have been investments in new factories, new businesses, new job opportunities, and instead it's gone to pure government waste. It's where we've gotten the inflation from. It's held down wages for decades. You can trace back an enormous amount of the economic hardship going on to the debt and to that political corruption.
And we always hear from the left, Democrats, this is a key talking point, especially with a presidential election in 20 days, that all of this is caused because of tariffs, that tariffs are completely terrible. Can you touch up on tariffs and how they could positively impact our economy here in the United States?
So absolutely. There's a nuance, as always, right, that's missing from the way these politicians talk about things. So, I actually think the most fundamental thing to understand about this is that the U.S. is the only industrial country on the planet that taxes our domestic production that is exported. Who would have thought you'd do that, right? But we literally double tax our exporters. And then I'll give you one even better. So if you produce goods here in the U.S. and you sell them in the U.S., you face taxation. But if you import that same good and then go to sell it here, guess what? It's a tax loophole. You're completely outside of the tax system. So we are the only industrial country to do this. Most other countries, everyone else we trade with, everyone else who's competing with us on the international scene, they don't tax their exporters. They let foreign sales taxes tax their exporters. And then they only tax their domestic consumption of production. So they don't double tax their exporters. And if you import a good into foreign countries, it faces the same tax rate as their domestic production. So you can use tariffs here to right that imbalance, to make our tax system work the same way, where you don't have a tax subsidy for imports and where you're not double taxing our exporters. So, that's one of those nuances that's missing from this story, is that for decades now, right, our industries have faced this undue tax burden, have faced our own government stealing from taxpayers to subsidize foreign industries. No other country does that.
Why do you think we've been handicapped like that? Was this some kind of policy put forth by left, right, somewhere, and how do we change that?
So a lot of it is just pure incompetence, right? I worked on the Hill for almost 8 years, and when you talk to these people, you realize they don't know a lot of what's going on. They trust staffers who don't know a lot of it. But, part of it is they've got donors that walk in the room who sit them down. They got pretty kind of, reports and things, and a lot of times these donors come in, and they're companies and trade groups and whatever, and they say, hey, I need you to vote for this bill, or I need you to introduce this bill. Now, if you look in the fine print, what does the bill do? It favors them and their friends over their competitors. Tale as old as time in politics, right? So some of this is very intentional from those groups who are looking to get an edge, right? There's a lot of retailers in the U.S. who have fought these kinds of fixes precisely because they like getting the subsidy to bring in foreign goods, and they don't care about our industrial base. They don't care about American workers, right? So, it's a combination of that, right? The incompetence, a lack of conviction from our members of Congress, and just pure graft and corruption from these companies who, instead of making a good product, try to buy off politicians and buy the laws they want.
There's always a lot of competing interest into how to profit off a country, especially if you're not from a country, if you're a foreign country, if you're just a foreign individual. We were speaking yesterday, and I feel like we have this trifecta of three different ideologies that want to all destroy America, whether it be to create their own hegemony on the East, or for a religious purpose or anything, or for George Soros, which is whatever his reason is. But how have we been inundated and infiltrated so much that we're just bleeding all this because we have competing interests that want to see us destroyed?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think, to that end, right, what is America at its essence, right? It is the first country founded in human history to be a place for anyone who believes in freedom, who believes in moral objective laws, who believes in God's law, frankly, right? And the U.S., because of that, became a refuge for people who wanted to build a better life for their families, their communities. Every other country in human history, right? And every country that was around at the time our country was founded was devoted to forcing most of the people of the country to work for the benefit of the monarch and the elite nobles, right? The U.S. was the refuge, and that's why the U.S. has been the most advanced, the most prosperous country in human history, has lifted billions of people out of poverty. So all these interests you're talking about, these are people who want to go back. They want to go back 200 years ago to a world where most people weren't free, most people weren't prosperous, and your life was there, your existence was there to service the nobles and the monarchs. That's where they want to drain us back to. And I think you're right. We are bleeding. They have taken over so many institutions. But I'll tell you this, though, and part of why I'm here, I'm always optimistic. It just takes the American people to wake up, to say no more, and that we want to go back to those founding values, and we can flip the script just like that.
Can you touch up a little bit about the ideological difference and approach that you see between progressives and conservatives on the Hill, especially when it comes down to congressional spending? Because we do see a difference. One side seems to want to gut the government, and maybe you can touch up on that about how they can do that, where the other side seems to think that we can just print as much money as we can, especially since I guess we are the one that are in charge of the U.S. dollar.
Well, I would say there's a third group of staffers on the Hill. So I think you're right. There's the progressives who just want to print money and create inflation and drain everybody's savings to promote their government ideology. Then there's this, unfortunately, small group of conservatives, right? The people you're talking about who want to give that money back to the American public. But there's this much larger middle group who are the go-alongers. These are people who mostly work for Republicans, right? Who you would think are conservatives. But really, what do? They just sign off on everything the progressives want. They don't have the backbone. They don't understand what's at stake. They're not willing to work with the conservative members, and they don't believe in progressive ideology, but they are as bad as the progressives because they just sign off on and go along with everything they're doing. So I think, what the conservatives try to do, and I think the Freedom Caucus is a good example of this, they assert the point, right, that whenever the government commits to spend $1, it is committing to steal that dollar from somebody who worked hard to earn it. So, most people are sold this bill of goods that government spending is free benefits, that it can somehow generate prosperity. All government can do is redistribute wealth and destroy wealth along the way. So I was proud to be one of those conservatives when I was on the Hill, working to put up the correct vision, to showcase the people. The government isn't there to give you free stuff. It is shooting somebody else to get that stuff, to give it to you, and they will come for you next.
You said that there's some Republicans who say that they are for fiscal conservatism, yet they sign off on all of these huge spending bills, a lot of wasteless spendings, funding programs that are useless. Why is that? Are they falling under the pressure of the media? Do they believe this is actually in the interest of their constituents? What is the whole reason behind that?
Yeah, I think they're falling into the trap of it. But, the other part of it is they want to get reelected, right? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, care more about the gig. They view it as a good gig. They care more about getting reelected than they care about the truth or actually helping people to be empowered and have prosperity. So for them, it's easy. It's easy for any politician to go in front of you and say, I'm going to promise you free stuff. Put me in office, whatever you want, the moon, the sun, the stars, I'll give it to you, right? And so what happens is they get in office, they make all these promises, and then you don't see the cost, right? It's a haircut taken off the top of 100 million Americans who are slightly poorer off, who can't afford the home they would have bought. But you can see where the benefits go. There's some company that gets the subsidies, right? There's some donor in your district who can say, hey, I employed 10 people. You don't see the 100 jobs that they had to destroy.
We were speaking about this earlier. The Federal Reserve and the way it prints money, there's a saying that says, it's impossible to pay back every dollar that's been lent out because that dollar is printed with interest. So there's not enough money to pay back all the money that's owed. And this is the game at the end of the day. Can you talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve and its creation and what it's done to America?
So I think the way you just spoke about it, it's really a Ponzi scheme, right? It's a Ponzi scheme against the future, right? So if you think through what's happened over decades here, everybody has a sense that wages haven't kept up, that the cost of living has expanded faster than people's incomes, that good job opportunities are rare, you can't get your hands on it. Really what that is decades of loss, decades of poverty created by the decades before that. The Federal Reserve's been around since 1913. The period of time suspiciously, from the end of the Civil War to 1913, was a period of declining prices, of massively increasing wages, of electrification of the country, of mass industrialization. Fortunes were going up. Everybody was better off. What happened in 1913? Creation of the federal income tax, creation of the Federal Reserve. Immediately thereafter, you had 30 years of world wars that profited the bankers, the industrialists who profited from war, who were involved in this cabal. And you see it crystal clear, plain as day. The weakest 30-year period of economic growth, but I give you one even worse than that. The last 30 and 40 years have been about as weak in terms of aggregate growth as that period of time that includes the world wars and the Depression. And it is because what the Fed does, what the income taxes, what all of this does, it allows you to steal from people now, to steal their resources, to sap investment that would go into future prosperity. And by doing so, it makes every generation that will come later poorer by shifting that power and that wealth to bureaucrats and politicians today.
And the way I think about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is I call it like the welfare for the wealthy. Because welfare for poor people, you get a check or something from the government, but the wealthy just live off government interest, and you can keep collecting more bonds and buying bonds and doing all these things and just literally sucking more money out of the government. So I feel like people on both sides are living off welfare. One is just saying, oh, I'm rich, and then the other people, oh, you're poor, you get government welfare.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. One of my favorite quotes is from Ron Paul, who said that foreign aid is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. But I'll tell you the thing about that. That's all government policy. Foreign aid just does that across national borders. But that's what domestic policy looks like as well for governments. That's exactly what you said there. So the way that I look at economics, right? You think of people like Henry Ford tinkering in his own garage to make the first Model T. He generated billions and billions of dollars, really an incalculable level of prosperity for Americans by figuring out how to cheaply make an automobile that could mean that goods were accessible, that people could go get high-paying jobs. He made a fortune, right? But he made it the right way. He made it because the fortune he collected was representative of prosperity he generated for other people. What you're talking about is tragically the shift that's happened, which is that you can either make money the right way, generating prosperity for others, or you can make it the wrong way by being part of the cabal that uses the government to steal that prosperity generated by everybody else. And if you look over time, that's increasingly what's happening. The people who have power, the people who have money, got there because they're part of the government cartel, not fighting to generate real prosperity for the rest of us.
So with the presidential election in 20 days or so, Kamala Harris for a while has been essentially dangling a carrot above all these people, telling them $25,000 for first-time home buyers, $50,000 for new businesses, a bunch of subsidies covered by taxpayer money. Who's going to pay for that?
Oh, you are through inflation, right? And I think that's really the end of the day. That's those false promises that she and the rest of the progressive left have. And unfortunately, and that kind of go along right, is that they'll look at you and say, I've got free benefits from you. They don't tell you it comes from the Fed's printing press. And as the Fed prints those dollars, where does it get the value, the purchasing power in those dollars? It steals it from every other dollar in existence. In 1913, before the Fed was created, a dollar then was worth $31.50 today. Put $31 and 2 quarters out in front of you. That is what $1 did in 1913. And it is this slow decline, 110 years of false promises that have slowly chipped away to the point where the dollar now is worth only 3%, a little bit under actually, of what it was in 1913. So that's what she's promising there. But I give you one other thing I think that's fascinating to me on this one. You were talking about the 50 grand she's promises to small businesses. So if you listen to her, she talks about saying that, oh, you got a small business, you want to start a small business, I got 50 grand for you. Then you listen to the next sentence longer, and what she says is it's a 50 grand deduction for startup costs. This is the disingenuous part of this. Mm-hmm. Every cost you have as a small business to get up and running is already deductible.
Yep.
So what is startup costs in the tax code? It's the money you spend before you incorporate. It costs a few $100s to incorporate. That's most small businesses' startup costs. The only people who are spending 50 grand before you incorporate are people who have the money to do market research before you start the business. It is a tax break precisely for her friends. It is a tax break at the expense of real working class people, of real small business owners, to the people that donate to her campaign.
And we've seen how illegal immigration has just ramped up in the last 3.5 years under their administration. What is the overall impact that it has on our economy when we see the federal government subsidize so much of their stuff when it comes down to taking them from the detention center to whatever sanctuary city they want to be in? Once they get into that sanctuary city, like New York City, they're provided affordable housing, but they don't pay for it. Again, it's subsidized by the federal government. They get iPhones, they get these EBT cards and whatnot. What is the overall impact that has on the actual welfare system that we have here that is meant to help low-income Americans?
Well, this is, again, some of that destruction of the culture that we've been talking about. So it used to be, right, that immigrants coming to the U.S. came here because they wanted opportunity. Now they're coming because they want to be opportunistic, right? You used to have the United States where we had opportunity for all, we had prosperity for all, and if you came and you were willing to work, you were willing to abide by our values, you wanted to strengthen our culture, you could get ahead. In fact, you could become fabulously wealthy, right? Now what's happening is we are importing in immigrants who hate us. They hate our values, they hate what we stand for. They view the U.S. not as having generated wealth, which was what we did. They view the U.S. as having stolen wealth. And they are coming to pillage and plunder. And that is the overt statement. You can listen to everybody from AOC to Harris, everybody on the left saying this, right? That they have this notion that Americans, people who are born here, whose families have been here for generations, owe this, that they owe their life work, that they owe their generational wealth to these people coming in. California, as you're pointing out, is handing $150,000 to illegal aliens to buy a home. Why can't Americans get access to that? And again, where does that $150,000 come from? It comes from federal grants to the state of California to do that. And where did the federal government get it? They printed the money.
And why do they get $150,000 and we only get $25,000?
Exactly, right? Yeah, right.
The hypocrisy
right,
there.
Yeah. And we get the inflation bill on top of that. So I think, that's the spear tip of this. But, even in New York, it's one thing, right? New York's a large city. Springfield, Ohio, a town of 60,000 residents, many of whom have been there for generations. 20,000 immigrants were dumped into Ohio, right? And Harris likes to point out that they're here legally. They were illegal aliens that were granted amnesty, right? You can't make this stuff up.
I'd like to kind of touch on something you mentioned earlier about there's a whole group of congressional staffers that just want to get wins and stay in power. And I think that's one of the major issues why they vote on these ridiculous bills. Because if you say, I'm going to cut the government, I'm going to take things away, that's not a good way to get reelected. So everyone just keeps doing the same thing. And this is why I love Elon and he calls his Doge, the Government Efficiency Committee or whatever.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's ever been anyone to come into the government with so much stature to say, I'm going to cut the government. And going back to something you said even earlier than that we don't actually produce anything. There's people who just live off the government. I would always think if these people are fired, if you fire, let's say 50% of the government, those are smart people. They're just in the wrong business. Let them go out into the free market and actually use their knowledge and create capital and create production.
Precisely. The way that I always talk about it is, we talk about GDP. It's this big number. You don't know what it really means. You know that it's somewhat the economy. GDP is the dollar value of the service we do for each other, right? And you're absolutely right. There are good, smart people who work in the government, but even more, there are good, smart people who work in the private sector fighting against the government. We spend as a country $400 billion a year complying with the tax code. That is about half the defense budget. Wow. So for every dollar that Americans spend defending us from China and Russia, we spend 50 cents defending ourselves from the IRS.
Wow.
And all of that, right, is, to your point, representative of real people, of real talents, of real skills, of real passions, who are wasting their life's work, either from the government oppressing their fellow citizens or in the private sector fighting that oppression from the government. One of my colleagues here has 2 books on his bookshelf. One that is How to Value a Business, something integral to everything about the market, right? How do you understand, how do you assess the real prosperity generated from a business? That's one book. The book next to it that's about twice as large is volume 1 of How to Deal with the Federal Tax Code. And that tells you exactly the kind of waste you're talking about there.
I like how Vivek puts this, and I don't want to misspeak, so let me just paraphrase what he says, is that there's, I believe, something like 1/3 of all companies in the country actually don't make a profit. They rely on, I think they call them like ghost companies, where they rely on lending to actually stay as a company. And what is that? And is that even tenable?
Well, you have to ask the question, where does the lending come from, right? So this is where we get into one of my fun topics, which is fractional reserve banking, right? So the Federal Reserve, of course, not just dictates the money supply. And, most people, when they think of, you ask them what money is, they think of cash, they think about what's in your bank account. Most of the money that exists was created by lending, right? So when banks lend money, they keep a portion of the deposit money coming in, they lend out the rest. A huge percentage of that then gets deposited. So now the money's in two places. Then they keep a fraction of that, lend the rest out. Large portion of that gets deposited. And so you have this Russian nesting doll of deposits that get turned into loans that then become deposits. And if this sounds like a Ponzi scheme shell game to you, maybe you're right. But so the answer then, right, is this lending that businesses are relying on is really just an echo of the Fed's policy to allow banks to just create money literally out of nothing. And so that's why it can be a subsidy, because it truly is a subsidy. And that's when the Fed says, oh, we've run the numbers and this is what we need to do to help the economy, that's all crap. The Fed is sitting there thinking of how much fake money do we create today? How much fake money do we let banks create today to prop the numbers up, to keep things humming along, to keep these businesses fat and happy? This isn't the way it worked in any of the periods of U.S. history that had dynamic growth and dynamic economic optimism.
And how much of this is due to them being politicized? Are they politicized, or are they hijacked by some sort of ideology that seems to be doing nothing positive for the American people?
I would say it's both, right? So, keep in mind, they I think are certainly beholden to an ideology that is absolutely morally bankrupt. But, the other part of it is when they want to understand what to do in the economy, they call in these bankers, they call in these businesses, and they say to them, well, what would you like us to do? I think the important thing about this, right, is what is good for big business is not always what is good for the free market, right? The free market is a level playing field where you can get ahead by merit, where you get wealthy by generating prosperity for others. Individual businesses, their easiest added value to them is to simply get government subsidies. Mm-hmm. So you have these businesses walk in the door, both at the Fed and in Congress and in the White House, right, saying, I need you to just give me subsidies. Well, that's stealing from somebody else to give to a business that has long outlived its usefulness. Look at the comparison of Boeing to SpaceX, right? Boeing is one of the storied American companies that got us to World War II. They were one of the first airplane producers on the planet, right? An amazing company with an amazing history. What the hell is happening now, right? It's a story of government subsidies and the corrosive and corruptive effect that happens when you go from being a real company generating real prosperity to a company captured and then addled by and beholden to the welfare state, the way you were talking about earlier.
And also to DEI, right?
Absolutely.
That's been a leading factor behind it.
Yeah, what do you think Larry Fink's ultimate goal is? Because I have a friend who did his master's thesis on Larry Fink, and what he told me was that he found out that Larry Fink couldn't compete in a market that was already saturated, so he had to create his own new market, and this entire climate change is, we're manufacturing solar panels and this and that, when, the answer is really in nuclear reactors.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you're absolutely correct about that. But, this is exactly what happens. But, you can't blame people for being greedy. People are greedy. People are corrupt. That's actually why we believe in having laws, right? It's why we try to aspire to have government laws match divine law. The idea of saying that we want to have a society that respects people's individual rights and where we're not corrupted by the individual sin of one person or another. In a free market, he wouldn't have gotten by. In a free market, he would have had to have gone and gotten a respectable job somewhere, figuring out what real value he could contribute for the rest of the community. There is one entity, and only one entity in an economy, that can confer monopolyship, that can confer power and wealth without you having produced something for the community, and that is government. And it is because government is a forced monopolist, because it can print whatever dollars it wants, it can club you over the head to take whatever tax money it wants, and it can move that wealth, redistribute that wealth, not based on merit, but based on government fiat. So there's a market niche for inventing whole industries, movements, climate change, DEI, etc., purely because there's a government, and there is at least so far a voting public that is willing to maintain a government, that'll do that kind of welfare distribution.
So what do we do about BlackRock? I mean, we've never seen an entity this large, $20 trillion under assets under management. It's larger than most governments at this point. It runs everything. It dictates how you get money. They own the majority shares of 80% of the S&P companies. Like, what is this behemoth? And how is it allowed to do this?
So I think the thing that people have really quietly missed on this one, right, and I'm glad you brought this up, is that they're not using their money to get this power. So BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard offer people this thing, which is, hey, you give me your hard-earned money, and I'll let you buy into a fund we run that gives you access to all of the large companies in the United States. So what they've done is used your money to buy these stocks. Now, yes, you own the underlying asset. What you don't own are the voting rights. So what you are giving them for free is the voting power of your shares in the company. This is actually something Heritage has been big on. We would like to see a change in the law on this one. Either one of two solutions, right? Either proxy voting. The voting rights of the shares go to the holders of the underlying asset. So you give those voting rights back to the American public whose retirement savings are being used by these companies to buy those shares. Or you force those companies to actually abide by the rules that everybody else has to abide by, which is that you have to do what's in the best interest of the shareholders. You have to do your fiduciary duty to vote for return to shareholders. Now, for anyone listening, right, who would say, well, aren't returns to shareholders simply profits? Is that waste? Let me stop you right there. Profits to shareholders are representative of the value generated by a company to either government subsidies or to the American public. The more we get subsidies out of the way, the more that those profits are representative of companies having done real good work for the American public. The only reason they're getting away with this, the only reason that these companies are voting to keep having them lose profits, is because they are destroying our wealth, parking it in DI, parking it in this climate change, farce, right? So that's the solution. Either proxy votes back to the people that put their money in, or force these companies to vote in the interests of the shareholders.
Yeah.
Do you think that we actually have a true free market here in the United States with all the government regulations and bailouts and subsidies and all this various stuff?
Oh, of course not, right? But that's the left and the progressives, right? They want to take the products of a free market, but they reject the methods. They wear the free market like a skin suit, pretending that that's what's going on, when really under the hood, under the mask, is this corrupt really return to kind of medieval feudalism.
Yeah. Can the United States actually sustain, though, if, let's say, we remove income tax mandatory, like having to pay income tax, essentially? I mean, essentially, I'm asking, can we shift away from having to pay taxes? Is that actually sustainable in the United States?
I think it absolutely is. So keep in mind, until 1913, the government was funded almost exclusively on tariff income, and tariffs weren't that high, right? We had very little revenues. The U.S. government kept a pretty small standing military, which kept us safe. In fact, we had fewer wars. We had fewer casualties on battlefields having a smaller standing military, who would think, right? And so I think part of the question right now is there's a lot of things that the government runs that are programs that are quasi-debts. So Social Security, Medicare are perfect examples, right? You've paid in, the government owes you back benefits on that. So there's some transition period you would need, right? The government needs to make good on those debts. We can't leave people hanging who we stole all of their retirement savings for and promise them benefits that won't come to them. But absolutely, there's a way to transition to back to the way it was for 150 years, right?
Yeah, we speak to liberals all the time, and we debate them, and they have the same talking points all the time. And one thing that they can't get around is if they're anti-tariff, essentially what they're saying is that they are producing things in China, which has one of the worst humanitarian records, which is produces about 32% of all the CO2 emissions compared to America, which has about 12% or so. So we tell them, if you are against tariffs, you are for producing overseas. We don't have any strategic way to actually put pressure on them to change their human rights because they're making all our stuff. They own all our debt. They own farmland and homes here now. And you're also okay with a very dirty country, climate-wise, producing our goods. So we always ask them, how do you marry those two ideas? And they never have an answer.
Well, they run away, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so I can give you the answer that they're being brainwashed to, and they are being so incepted and brainwashed. That's why they can't give you the answer on it. They believe in wealth redistribution, not just across people in a country, but across countries. Right? I think if you think through everything you were just talking about, I think you're absolutely right about that. What is that really, that nexus? It is the redistribution of wealth from the West to the non-West. That's what it is, right? What they're being brainwashed by all of these kind of liberal elitists that have them and are draining them of any creativity, of any critical thinking. What they're putting in its place is a brainwashing that China deserves our wealth, that the global South, as they call it, deserves our wealth. So they don't care, as you pointed out, that India and China burned vastly more coal than the U.S. did in its entire history, right? They don't care about the emissions from those countries. They just care about them from the U.S. It's really because they don't think we deserve the wealth, the technology that we generated, that we produced. That's the ideology that's at the heart of this.
Do you think that it's because they've been led to believe that this is in the name of social justice?
Yes. So I think one of the most dangerous things the left has done is given people the idea that all prosperity comes at the expense of somebody else. And we know that's not true. I'm not good at making clothes, not the best cook. If I had to make food on my own, if I had to go hunt the animals I eat myself, if I had to make my own clothes, I would have starved to death a long time ago, right? All of our prosperity comes through cooperation, right? The cooperation of not just 330 million Americans, but 8 billion people. And it is in that cooperation that people can do the thing they're good at, that they're passionate at, and generate that value for everybody else. The left has slowly, over a century, brainwashed people to think that prosperity only comes from exploitation, that it only comes as a zero-sum game. That's the thing we need to break up. That's the thing that I think is brainwashing these people.
And I think we've kind of gotten to the point where now we're kind of getting into the realm of ideologies and which ones want to win, because that's literally been the entire world, is competing ideologies. Who's right, who's wrong? How can I make you destroyed so I can be more powerful? And I feel like the left has really gotten good at playing this quasi-capitalist, quasi-communist game, as we were speaking about yesterday with Deng Xiaoping and China combining both those hybrid theories. I did want to touch actually something on economics, because I know we run a kind of Keynesian economical structure where whenever we have a depression or a recession, the government just spends. So the idea is that it's supposed to lessen the impact of that recession or depression, and it's not working. Are there any new ways of doing what Keynesian economics tried to do that we've come up with? Or
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad we're touching on that. So, I think the important thing to keep in mind here, right, is when we're talking about what the economy is, if you ask a conservative, right, we would talk about, it's about producing stuff, right? Ultimately, you have a limited amount of time, you have a limited amount of ability to work and produce things. And so economics is really as simple as saying, I've got labor hours and I got capital, which is really, it's not money, it's tools. It's the microphones in front of us, it's factory equipment that produces the clothes on our back, the concrete that goes into our buildings. That's really what the economy is. The money is there to be a medium of exchange, to record information about the value of the things produced and the resources given up to produce those things. So you talk to a conservative, and it's a real conversation about how you coordinate people's work to produce real things. You talk to a Keynesian, it's all about money, right? And money is great, but it's only useful if you can use it to produce real stuff, if you can use it to get your hands on real stuff. So when Keynesians are talking about a recession, they miss the point that we're having a recession because there's some drop off in the production of real things, right? There's some real drop in oil accessibility. There's some crop failure, something like that. I can print money. You can't print crops that failed. You can't print oil that that went offline in terms of production, right? So when the left says and the Keynesians say, well, we'll just smooth it over, we'll just paper over a recession by printing money, all you're doing is clouding the price signals in the market. So the actual actors in the economy have a harder and harder time re-coordinating to figure out what went wrong, where the real shortage is, and how to do the hard work of producing real things again. So where does that come out? It comes out as inflation. And if you think of it this way, you can have a recession in two different ways. Either a bunch of people can lose their jobs, and so those people lose income, or everybody takes a haircut through inflation. And that's really all the Keynesians are doing, is they're just trading off unemployment for inflation. There's nothing magical. And when you do that, you deepen the recession, you extend the length of time it takes to get out of that. So what I would say is the new way to do it is the old way to do it. which is there's some real harm. There's some people who are really less fortunate, who lose their jobs, who you want to help. You can actually give them a little bit of aid, a small percentage of the economy, that helps those people get back on their feet, that helps them to not be homeless, to not starve in a recession. But otherwise, don't redistribute trillions of dollars across the economy. Let the private sector do what it does. These are the real business owners, the real inventors and entrepreneurs who know their trade. They know how to get the economy back up on its feet faster.
One argument that we always hear when we do these TikTok lives and we talk to 20, 30 of these Kamala voters a day is that when it comes down to the taxes, that in 2018, Trump's tax plan actually benefited the wealthy. They say the wealthiest, the billionaires and whatnot. But that is objectively false. Can you maybe touch up on that and maybe just simplify it as much as you can, that so people at home understand that his 2018 tax plan actually benefited the middle class way more than any other class?
The proof is in the data, right? Under Trump, after the tax bill was passed, we had the lowest unemployment level in 50 years, in 2 generations, right?
Wow.
We had the fastest wage growth we'd had in more decades than that, right? We had groups of people who historically have no generational wealth starting to build equity. Amazing things going on. And you're right, it's not the billionaire class that's getting that. It's the middle class, it's low-income people. They were seeing the real benefits of it. But, right now, and if you listen to Harris a little bit, she'll talk about the need to cut taxes because people's taxes are about to go up to the tune of $2,000-$3,000 for an average family. That's the Trump tax cut expiration. So she's willing to admit it, just not give credit where credit's due on that one.
And that's the funny thing that I've noticed lately is that it seems like they love Trump's tax plan. They love all of his economic proposals, whether it's tariffs, because they kept intact majority of them and introduced new ones like 2 weeks ago, 100% tariffs on all EV cars from China. Yet their base, what they're communicating to them is that tariffs are bad. Trump's tax plan was only beneficial for the rich. And what are they going to do? Let's say Kamala Harris wins at the end of 2025 when the taxes are supposed to expire. Is she going to extend Trump's tax cuts? So, yeah, it's pretty funny, honestly.
Well, another one on that, right, is that she supports a global minimum tax, right? So you've got all of these European countries, all these countries who you're talking about are stealing our investment, who tariff us. We don't tariff them, right? And these countries are trying to force the U.S. into a global minimum tax that would, of course, obliterate our businesses again. So, you see this common thread through everything, right? It's a tax system that helps their donors, that helps their friends, that helps the countries that they believe should have the wealth that Americans generated. They don't care about our prosperity.
Yeah. I'd like to turn to a topic of the future because I'm a big fan of AI. Obviously a cautious fan.
Yep.
And I know Elon says it could be the best thing or the worst thing that we've ever created. But with the implementation of the autonomous semis that Elon's coming out with, and other companies, including Tesla, now doing the robo-taxis, which is going to displace millions of people, the backbone of our one of the backbones of our society, which are truck drivers, people who actually move goods and services around. What do you think about UBI? Let me kind of explain what I would like to see, and then let me know if there's any holes or if you think something different. So I see the grown automation of a robot that never has to take time off, doesn't come into work feeling less than 100%, is not going to sue the company, and that's a massive increase of production there. Obviously, there's no humans. So in my version of UBI that I think would be really good is that if there is some kind of VAT tax that it goes directly to the people, bypassing government and getting their hands in it, sort of like Social Security was supposed to be, I guess. And then at that point, you can cut massive government spending or welfare programs because you have the money going directly to the people. Therefore, you need less people in the government to administer, less forms filled out and things like that. What do you think about that?
Well, so I think there's one part of that, right, which is can you keep the government out of that?
Yeah.
And so I'll give you kind of one stat on that one. Right now, if you just want to write a check to people to end poverty, just poof like that, right, you could do it for $2 trillion a year, which is a lot of money, right? The federal government currently spends $4.25 trillion on wealth redistribution. So the first thing is I'm very skeptical, right? You could have some kind of fixed tax like that really goes directly to the people. I think you would end up with an enormous amount of graft. I think it could be well-meaning. You'd come back in 30 years and you'd go, oh my God, we created another Fed. We created another income tax. All these programs started like that. Social Security was billed as a guarantee of non-poverty income, right, of getting out of poverty for seniors. It's a vastly larger program now, right? The income tax started as a tax just on the wealthiest Americans. Well, we know how that story went. So I think that's my first kind of skepticism, right? But I think on the other side of it, I don't think you need it, and I'll tell you why. So, if you think through what has happened in labor markets over the last 200 years, the average work week was 80 hours a week. And it used to be that you spent almost all of your life working. So if you said, okay, how many hours do people work now in the U.S.? And if you said, all right, what if I dumped a bunch of workers into the U.S. who worked the same percentage of their life, the same number of hours a week as workers 200 years ago, you actually could work every job in the U.S. with about 15% of the current labor force.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
So at the same time, though, unemployment's actually, we're, a couple of years ago when Trump was president, the lowest it had ever been, right?
Yeah.
So what's happening, right? Well, what's happening is over time, as we get more, because really everything is automation, right? Every piece of initial factory equipment, steam engines, they're all little bits of automation, right? AI is kind of a dramatic feeling, new automation, but it's really been a lot of automation over 200 years. So what happens is as we have more mechanical automation, what it is required from humans to be working a full job goes down and down over time. Now, prior to the massive government and the regulations and the spending and the taxes and all of this, no one was concerned. So there was actually much more displacement out of jobs in the 19th century and the early 20th than we've had now. But there also wasn't the restriction on investment. So you'd have new technology generating prosperity over here, which turned into profits that turned into seed capital over here. So people were seamlessly getting pulled out of jobs that paid less, trained and put in the jobs that actually were less demanding, that were actually lower skilled, but paid a lot more, right? Talk to any farmer, and they will tell you that actually farming is really one of the most high-skilled jobs on the planet, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So the truth is, and I would make this argument, most jobs have actually gone down in skill over time. They've gone down in how demanding they are. We're all working right now, right? My family were subsistence farmers 100 and something years ago. So I think what's going on right now is you've got a lot of workers who are really being displaced who can't get another job precisely because the government comes in the middle, goes to their potential employers and says, no, I want that money. You need to spend that money on climate change. You spend it on DEI. You can't spend that money on building a new factory, on training workers, on finding people. So what we're getting right now is the creative destruction. We're not getting the creative construction because of government. So I think AI is a tremendous tool to bring prosperity, to reduce the amount of labor hours you need to produce things. What you need is the government out of the way. I don't think you need a UBI. I think that the economy would create much more prosperity for everybody only if we get the government out of the way. If we don't, I think you're right. We're going to have an underclass. We're going to have people that just don't get that opportunity at all. That's the linchpin in my mind.
Richard, to turn the page like
Tim Walt's wife.
Tim Walt's wife,
Right.
exactly. I'd love to know, you spent quite some time on the Hill, right? 7 years or so?
Yep.
What is one of the craziest moments that you've had on Capitol Hill, or maybe take us in the inside of what it's like to work on the Hill?
Yeah, I'll give you a fun story on this one. So this was a few years ago. I don't remember actually which year this was, but early in my time on the Hill, leadership, establishment were trying to ram through a spending bill that, like all of these, half the bill was not spending. It was new programs, new regulations, all kinds of other things that was masked as being part of avoiding a government shutdown. The government never really shuts down. We know that, But so there was a whole group of us, and the boss I worked for at the time was kind of leading this coalition, who actually stopped the vote. We had just enough votes to kill the bill, right? Now, what ensues for the next 10 hours, and I mean 10 hours, sitting on the Hill, is they held the vote open on the floor of the House. So the vote's just open for 10 hours. And what is the leadership doing? They are running around, and their staffers and the members are running around, literally popping in the offices of these members who are with us, yelling at them, berating them in front of their staff, right? Grabbing staffers in the hall and being like, I know you work for so-and-so.
Wow.
So, so we were having a good time. I got sent over to Bullfeathers, which is a restaurant near the house, to pick up chicken wings and french fries and bring it back. We had a party. We had our members there. But part of that is because if you were out in the hall, you were going to run into the speaker who was just roaming the halls, yelling at people to get down to the floor. Now, I'll tell you part of this story, right, is this is what happens all the time, right? Leadership strong arms people, yells at people, they berate people, staffers and members of Congress, politicians who are all, kempt and professional on camera, swearing like you couldn't believe in the hallways at members and staffers. And they finally were able to bludgeon 2 of these members into switching their vote. So after 10 hours of holding the vote open, they go to the floor, they put their vote card in, they switch their vote, and the person with the gavel instantaneously, vote closed, bill passes, right? And that's just one of 100 stories that are like this, right?
So it's a circus.
It is
It's a
absolutely a circus, yeah.
And all we see are in front of the cameras, are very nice, polished people say nice things, and they don't know that they've been breaking arms for 10 hours.
Exactly right, yeah.
Wow.
And you also talked about off the record that you were one of the few people that were supporting Trump at the time when it was really unpopular on the Hill. And so what was that like?
So that was also, if you want to talk about being in a circus where you're ostracized, even more so, right?
Wow.
So I think one of the things is, a lot of the members of Congress, I don't really know why they're there, right? I think it's a good gig. I think a lot of them think they're going to get to do stuff. They don't really get how it works, right?
Insider trading.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, right. Though I'll tell you the truth, it's a handful of members who get it. Most members of Congress, they don't know anything about trading.
Yeah.
They don't know any of that kind of information. But, Pelosi, right, has a $25 million beachfront mansion in Florida. I'm sure she got that legitimately, right?
Yeah.
So, there's a few of those, right? But, for the staffers, though, I can tell you that broadly speaking, Hill staffers come to Congress because they want to do good things. They want to help people. They want to generate prosperity for people. But here's the rub. They get easily brainwashed, right? They have all these pressures. They have people looking at them saying, you can't do that. That's out of bounds. So the Hill was filled with people who were supporting the establishment candidates, right? They bought the lie. They were like, I don't know, Trump seems radical. That's what I liked about him. Mm-hmm. I had been there long enough, right? We'd had this vote I was just talking about. And I saw the corruption. I saw this revolving door of lobbyists, right, who are shilling for things they don't really believe in because the paychecks are good for companies who have long since left trying to make a good product, and their business model is to just out-lobby everybody else on Capitol Hill. And I watched that. And so I saw Trump, and I don't agree with Trump and everything, didn't then, don't now, but I saw somebody who had a good heart, who genuinely believed in freedom, right? Who understood this game, who was willing to stand up in public and willing to say, I'm not going to guarantee you much, but I will guarantee that I will fight for you, that I will fight to demolish this establishment. And so I'll tell you the truth, right? A lot of people at the time on the Hill and off the Hill, and people still say this, I want a debate, I want a political, race that's about policies. I'm a policy person. I want to tell you this. Campaign shouldn't be about policies. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of smart people who know things, who can sit down and tell you, the tax rate should be this decimal point, the tariff should be this, or the regulation should be that, or whatever. That's not who you elect a president for. A president is somebody who is good at reading people, at reading a room, somebody of strong convictions, of strong backbone, who will represent you and your community and your values in those rooms, who will know who the smart people are to bring together. The people who focus on policy, those are precisely the people who don't have conviction, who get there, who get into office, they don't know how to read the room, they don't know how to navigate it, and they get rolled. And that has been the last several decades of expanding regulations, expanding administrative state, expanding spending programs, expanding taxation. That's why I voted for Trump. And that's why I like Trump in the first minute when I was on the Hill.
Did you feel like you were, the odd one out? Were people looking at you weird, like, oh, this guy's a radical now, he supports Trump? And
to be fair, they viewed me as a radical beforehand.
Oh.
Which is right. And part of that's who I was working for and the things that we were supporting, right? So they viewed me as even more of a radical, right? In fact, a lot of people were like, oh, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that actually it was oddly empowering in the sense that there was a group of us, right? It was a small group, but there was a group of us that came together and we found each other, right? And a lot of them were the staffers who would stand up in meetings and be like, what the heck are you guys doing, right? This is bad. This isn't good for our constituents. Why are you telling your bosses to go along with this, right? Just because the leadership is banging down your door, right? So it was a group of us like that who came together. And so we gave each other a community, right? But yes, we were very unpopular outside of our little niche community, right?
We felt that too, in the college towns, for example.
Yeah, right.
You're like, I'm a Trump supporter. And it's like, oh, what? Why can you support him?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like what you said about the culture of Washington, where you have staffers who come in, they mean well, and then they just get sucked into the system. They have no power because they're young, and then they have to abide by the rules that the establishment has created. And when you were saying that, it reminded me of Hollywood, because that's exactly how it is, especially in the entertainment capital of the world. You go in, and then you just get corrupted by this system. How do we fix that system? Is it as easy as getting money out of politics? Is it something else?
So I'd say in an odd way, getting money out of politics, I think, doesn't deal with the whole situation. In fact, we've had periods of time where we didn't have money in politics. What we just had was strong men who were influential, mostly behind the scenes, right? Mm-hmm. In an odd way, there's a transparency about the money that's sometimes better than the real kind of shady backroom deal people who take over when there's no money. So I won't pretend that I think there's an easy solution or I've got it for that. But I will tell you, I think, what the long-term solution is, right? John Adams has a famous quote talking about the Constitution as being great for a moral society. And we, of course, have, going back to Plato, saying that people get the government they deserve. At the end of the day, I think it's about the culture of the people. If the American people believe in a small government because they believe in themselves, they believe that communities provide better for each other than the government does, if they believe that, as I said earlier, when the government commits to spend a dollar, it's committing to steal that dollar, then you will get a small government. The money in the politics, the strong man, the everything else, I think ultimately it's a reflection of the culture. And one of the things I'm proud about is the founding of the U.S., right? As I said before, we were a city on the hill, right? Refugees leaving Europe to come, and leaving in many cases the largest, most powerful, wealthiest countries on the planet. Our founding fathers fought against that mega superpower to form what was going to be, at least at the moment, a small backwater country, right? But they did it because what they were chasing was the moral principle, to create a society devoted to that kind of morality, that kind of devotion to freedom, to believing in people. We had a real faith in those kind of moralities and in our people and in our communities. Until Americans get back to that, you're going to continue to see this imperial city just redistributing wealth, redistributing power, and creating monopolist power centers. The culture needs to change. It starts with each of us.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there has to be a cohesive meta-narrative that the country pushes towards, and postmodernism is literally anti-meta-narratives. It's anti all that. The left is anti all that. So it seems like there's just two massively competing ideologies that right now we've seen the last 4 years. The left has really, taken a stronghold of it, and then you have this outsider in Trump who's trying to go back to that, originalist founder idea of just individual liberties. And as you were saying earlier, that we had massive unemployment, we had massive gains in the economy because Trump allowed people to keep more of what they earned and just be themselves more.
Absolutely. So I think, when you get down to the heart of what is leftism, right? What are they really pitching? They want you to hate yourself, really. The left offers an ideology that you can't manage your own life, that your neighbor is your enemy, that there's no community outside of me, the government, right? What does the right offer? And as you're saying, what does Trump offer? It's a positive vision. It's a loving vision of strong families and strong communities, of people coming together. That's what conservatism is. It's a recognition that our enemies are not each other. Our enemies are scarcity. Our enemies are the things that we don't have to fix yet. And you get there by working together as a community, by using your free agency to work with other people. It's the opposite of what the left believes. The left has a parasitic view of humankind, of all people. And they try to feed on that fear and that insecurity from people. They feed on people's sense that they're less than they can be. They feed on their sense that they need a master, that they need somebody to rescue them, and that their problems are somebody else's responsibility. And that in a nutshell, I think, is the evil ideology of the left.
Speaking of ideology, Richard, I've always wanted to ask somebody that actually understands the economy. Atlas Shrugged, have you read it?
Yes, oh yeah.
Okay,
yeah, of course.
So sometimes that ideology it contradicts what we as conservatives believe in. What is your whole perspective about Ayn Rand's philosophy there?
So I think you have to keep in mind the context of who she's writing to, right? She's writing to a population, she's Russian, she's writing to a population, right, who has been brutalized for centuries, really, not just under the Soviet period, into thinking that they can't run their own lives, into thinking that elitists are purely parasites feeding off the labor of, the farmers on their tenant lands, right? I think the thing she was trying to do was, and Adam Smith did this as well, is trying to get people to see what feels like greed, what feels like self-interest, as something different, as actually driving you towards doing things you're passionate about working in ways that are beneficial for other people. So I'm talking today, we've talked a lot about that kind of service-centric understanding of what the economy is. But she was writing the people who were convinced at the time that they couldn't do anything of service to anybody else, that if they did anything at all, it was necessarily greedy. So she was trying to get them comfortable with the idea that what can feel like greed really is just your ambition to do, to build, to create something. So I think if you understand the full context of where she's writing, it's not anti-family, it's not anti-community, it's trying to get people comfortable with the idea that you're not evil, that your ambition is not evil, that it actually can push you into doing things that while it seems like you're servicing yourself, it's really in production of things that service other people.
Do you think it's actually realistic, though, that we can sustain as a country, or even a certain state can sustain by if individuals aren't mandated to pay the taxes, but they pay it out of their own, I guess, self-interest because they want to see the community better and whatnot? And yeah.
Oh, I actually think so. I mean, so, to be realistic, there's probably some things, right? You probably need some minimal amount of spending that you're forcing people to pay into, maybe national defense. Though, truth be told, if people didn't have any taxes right now, you kept all your money, and you asked people, what government programs would you donate to? I bet you'd actually get a lot of donations to the military.
Yeah, I agree.
I wouldn't be surprised at all, right? If you actually offer donations, could fund the things that actually matter. But, the other part of that is an enormous amount of money that would be donated to programs, well-run private programs, to end poverty, to educate people, to bring them out of bad situations. It would get money that is currently going to taxes, right? All of that tax money is potentially money that would get donated anyway, right? And that's the thing that I think people miss, right, is the left paints this narrative that if the government doesn't do something, the private sector won't. The government does almost nothing, and it does nothing well.
Look at Boeing and SpaceX.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah,
that's a great example of that.
Yeah, I mean, we always, when we're debating these liberals, I won't call them liberals. I don't know. They don't know what they are, so I'm not going to define them. They're just people who are confused.
They're lost, yeah.
Yeah, so they'll try to bring up some policy position of Kamala Harris, and then they'll say all these little minute points. And I asked them, I said, do you think the government is a very efficient mechanism to create things? No. Okay, but you're advocating for more taxes, so you want to fund the thing that you just said is not efficient whatsoever instead of keeping it more in your pocket. And they have a really hard time just understanding that basic concept. And I can tell that a lot of times they agree with it, but they don't want to give me that they don't want to concede the point. So I don't know if people have been so inundated in these little minute back and forth fights, Kamala's plan, Trump's plan, where people have even forgotten, what do I actually believe is the right way of organizing society?
Because the left has replaced real ideology with allegiance to the club. Right. It's we'll download the next programming to you of what you need to believe and who you need to believe in tomorrow. Right. As opposed to giving them a real sense of firm ideology. But, I think it goes further than that. Really what the left has attacked is faith, the concept of faith. What you're talking about is faith. Right. I have faith that if I call an Uber, someone's going to show up and that they're not going to murder me. Right. I have faith that when I walk into a restaurant, they've made food, they haven't put poison in it. All of us, right, with the three of us sitting here right now, we have faith that the engineers, the architects that built this building knew what they were doing, right? And truth be told, that faith is rewarded 1,000, 10,000 times, right? Every day, everything you do, every product you use, there's a handful of times where somebody's a bad actor or somebody makes a mistake like that. And we take for granted all the things that work, all the prosperity we have in our life, but it all comes from that faithful approach. Because it's not just keeping the money in your pocket, it's letting an entrepreneur, an inventor keep their money, right? Wealthy people do get wealthier in free markets, but it's not because they're siphoning it from working class. It's not because the government's giving them free money. It's because they create products, they create businesses that are incredibly useful. People like the left likes to throw around that Musk or whoever is worth $100 billion. They don't have $100 billion. They own a business with warehouses and factories and delivery trucks and front offices that are worth $100 billion. There is no cash. They are mostly sitting on the buildings themselves. When the left says that they want to redistribute $1 billion from some billionaire, there is no money to redistribute. Do you want a piece of factory equipment to arrive on your driveway? I wouldn't know what to do with a piece of factory equipment. And the truth is, right, you are better off, we're all better off, with that factory equipment in the factory producing products we use than if it just randomly showed up in your driveway. That is the thing that the left can't get their heads around.
Yeah, one of the things I like to say is that if you took something like the top 100 wealthiest people in the country, their wealth is about $1 trillion. That $1 trillion would fund the government for about 100 days. Yeah. So what are you going to do after that? Now you have all the smart people broke, there's no money, and the country's still in debt.
Exactly. Well, again, what is the $1 trillion? It's factories, it's warehouses. So, if the government took possession of all these companies, disassembled the companies, sold the parts to probably the Chinese, right? Yep. And then took that money and ran itself, you're right, we'd be out of money, but also we would have quite literally physically destroyed all of those businesses. And that's the thing I think a lot of people don't quite see, right, is the way that I talk about economics to people is you either have a money-centric or a stuff-centric view of the economy. Money-centric is, I think, getting lost in the sauce of the cash flowing around. They think of billionaires just sitting on, gold bars and cash. The real version of it, a stuff-centric economy, is an understanding that there's actually much less money in the system than you think there is. That the money is there to serve as an information conveyor, to coordinate our actions. That really the economy is about producing real stuff. Phones, microphones, food, housing, those things. You can't redistribute those parts of it. I don't want random lumber and concrete on my door. No. I want somebody who knows what they're doing to turn it into a home for somebody.
I'm not an expert in the economy, and I've sat here and listened to you just simplify it so much, and it makes so much sense. Why do you believe the left just doesn't get it? I mean, seriously, it makes so much sense, and what they do, it just doesn't make sense at all. Why don't they see that?
Well, and I certainly appreciate that, and I'm happy to be here, right? I don't think it's that the elite left, they get it. Mm-hmm. They want everyone else to believe something that gives them power, right? A joke I always talk, but it's kind of a truth on this. It used to be the origin of every currency, if you go back far enough, comes back mostly to some volume of quantity of grain. Right, the dollar comes from the denarii, from Rome, and really what it's talking about is a day's ration, right? It used to be that the ubiquitous commodity everybody had was farm produce, right? Wheat, corn, whatever, right? And so if you went back to them and you said, hey, we're going to be Keynesians, we're going to print, 100 bushels of wheat, they'd be like, what are you talking about, right? So if you went back in time then and you tried talking about a central bank and a government that was going to do these kind of Keynesian modern monetary things, they'd say, none of that makes sense. It's only in the modern era, detached from real production, where you have this ideology of like, it's the money that's important. It's not the stuff, it's the money. Where you can convince people to say, well, I guess the Fed could print trillions of dollars. And then people cloud in their head that the dollar printing isn't the same as the stuff creation. That you can have the dollars, but you don't have the stuff. And you got more dollars, chasing fewer things, recipe for inflation, right? And so I think that's really what it is. The elite left is running around peddling this really just crap, inaccurate understanding of the economy because it gets people to vote them more power. It gets them to vote for a central bank at all, which is only historically one thing, a source of basically tax revenue through inflation for the government and those elite bureaucrats.
Yeah. So they're not actually stupid. They're doing this intentionally, manipulating the voters and, the perspective here just in order to inherit more money, power, the usual elite stuff.
Exactly. That's what I think. And I think it's why when you're talking to people who are on the front line of that, and you say, well, why? They can't answer the question.
No. Yeah.
They're in the tribe, they're brainwashed into it, but they're not given logical arguments. They're just like, well, there's money and it flows around and wealthy people have it and poor people don't have it. They don't see the guts of it because the elites don't want them to.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you for your time massively, Richard. It's been a great time talking to you, an honor, and we would definitely be talking to you more. Create some content.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, Richard. Thank you for sitting down and just simplifying this stuff to us, because then we can take this and bring it onto the battlefield, which is for us TikTok.
Well, it's a likewise pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much for your time as well. So,
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.